Welcome back, vinyl community. Dancehall style. Little after that, me put a tweeter box, make it sound a little sweeter. Man called Little John with an archetypal dancehall song from the Ghetto Youth LP. This is a recent pickup for me from the early 1983 on the Jah Guidance label. And that's a song called Dancehall Style. Archetypal dancehall record in that he's one of the singers that exemplifies that kind of energy that came forward in the early 1980s, was produced by Henry Junjo Laws is his nickname, and backed by the Roots Radix, the top producer and top backing band of the era that put dancehall on the map. I'm going to be talking a little bit about dancehall today. I've mentioned it in a few videos, gotten a few comments, so I thought I would do a bit of an explanation. Dancehall, strictly speaking, all Jamaican music is dancehall in that it's made to be played in a live setting, in a dance or a hall or whatever, or on an open lawn, and over a sound system, which the sound systems were huge mobile discos with big stacks of speakers. They would set up at various points all over the island, starting in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and moving through various styles of music. Some of the earliest key producers of Jamaican music, like Duke Reid with his Trojan sound system, which later gave its name to the Trojan label in England. C.S. Dodd with his Studio One label. They all started out with sounds, as many future producers would, honing their artists and their craft in the live dance hall setting. The dances formed a sort of a crucial cultural focal point on the island. They would play songs you wouldn't really hear on the radio. It would be kind of very limited, the local productions you would hear on Jamaican radio. And as well, many people couldn't afford turntables, couldn't afford to buy records, but they could afford to pay the gate fee at the local dance, go have a drink, enjoy themselves for the night, and hear songs and enjoy music. And that was a very lucrative market. It was hugely competitive between these different sound systems. Some of them employed gangs of young men to go and bust up the other sound, wreck their gear. Lots of dollars at stake, very competitive, eventually made its way onto record. The 60s were kind of dominated in Jamaican music by these three main sound men turned record producers. You had Duke Reid himself, C.S. Clement Seymour Coxsone Dodd as the Studio One head, and Prince Buster. By the 1970s, as the mood shifted into reggae, the style of reggae, eventually roots becoming more prominent, the scene kind of opened up. You had a lot of small producers, many still former or current sound system owners, but starting to put out their own music, their own labels, a lot of like cottage industry productions going on. And so that was kind of a free-for-all. Pretty well by the 70s, the Channel 1 studio with its Revolutionaries house band dominated the scene. That would be used by many different producers, so that basically the same band and the same studio on many different records by various producers. By the early 1980s, there had been a shift, or a shift was happening. Bob Marley died in 1981 as the huge king of reggae. He was, by that point, not the most popular artist in Jamaica. Artists like Jacob Miller were more popular domestically, as he had moved into an international market and kind of lost touch with the grassroots of what was going on in the dances in Jamaica. There had also been a shift in the social and economic climate. The 1970s had been typified by increasing economic crisis, huge levels of political violence between two rival political gangs, which employed gunmen to enforce their will. with various ghetto areas being turned into basically garrisons, where it was not safe to travel from one end of town to the other. By 1980, the election alone resulted in around 800 estimated violent deaths leading up to the election, when the right-wing Jamaican Labour Party, JLP, came into power. There was a easing off of the violence. This was basically a period of decompression on the island, and it was reflected in the music. The roots and culture themes of Rastafari, back to Africa, repatriation, these kind of things, they didn't go away completely, but they eased off a bit. If the roots singers of the 1970s were talking about the future, looking to the judgment to come and a brighter future and that kind of thing, the young dancehall artists coming up we're talking about today, being alive, enjoying themselves. And many of these artists had come up in the 1970s. One of the key ones who signaled the shift to the dancehall sound was a man called Lincoln Sugar Minot, is his name. Hugely influential, hugely prolific. He had started out as a member of the African Brothers Harmony Trio in the early 1970s, went solo, landed at Studio One, where he recorded a few albums. Studio One, by the late 1970s, was no longer one of the preeminent producers. That had shifted to a different axis. But the rhythms laid down at Studio One in the 1960s were still being redone, reversioned by other producers. C.S. Dodd, founder of Studio One, took a bit of exception to this and employed some of these younger, up-and-coming artists to do over his own rhythms and add a bit of a different touch, different approach to them. And this signaled a shift to dancehall, and Sugar Minot was one of the ones who did that. This is a solo LP called Black Roots in the early 80s. Appeared on Island Records' Mango imprint. Absolute classic. Iconic cover showing him in front of the sound system speaker boxes. And he left Studio One, founded his own Black Roots and Youth Promotion labels. There's a further one from him in this Youth Promotion yard. This appeared on the Greensleeves label in England. The Greensleeves label had started in the late 70s roots period, but they were ideally positioned with the right connections to the right producers as the sound was changing in Jamaica to release dancehall internationally and break it to a much larger audience, including Sugar Minot's, some of his releases. Sugar Minot founded his youth promotion label. He was a hugely prolific and successful solo artist. He was also very concerned with finding new talent, especially deserving ghetto youths. So his youth promotion setup was very concerned with bringing forward new talent and promoting new artists and giving back to the community. That was very much a part of his philosophy. You had a new crop of DJs coming up that typified the dancehall sound. One was the very influential General Echo, who brought a lyrical style called slackness to the forefront. Slackness had already been around in Jamaican music from very early days. It's basically sexually explicit lyrics, and he did it very well. But he did it with panache and humor, not really misogynist or offensive. Enormously popular on live dancehall settings. Only recorded a few albums. He was gunned down in 1980. He was riding in a car with two other men. They were pulled over at a police checkpoint, and the police opened fire for a reason that's never fully been explained. As far as I know, all three men were unarmed. The death sent a shockwave through the reggae community. Fellow DJs Clint Eastwood and General Saint responded with a song called Tribute to General Echo, which is a classic in its own right and was released on the Greensleeves label. Veteran reggae artists like Gregory Isaacs began to employ a more sensual approach, moving away from the roots and culture themes of the 1970s. This is a classic Night Nurse LP, again backed by the Roots Radix, who had taken over as the preeminent session band of the early 1980s from the Revolutionaries at Channel 1. There's the Roots Radix here. Basically Style Scott on drums. This is from the Rough Guide to Reggae, essential resource. But you've got Style Scott on drums, Errol Flabba Holt on bass, Bingy Bunny, the late Bingy Bunny on rhythm guitar, basically the core of the Roots Radics, who would go on to work very heavily with a producer called Henry Junjo Laws is his nickname. He was absolutely the top producer of the early to mid 1980s, released a huge, staggering amount of music with the Roots Radics band and dub versions mixed by Scientist, who had been an apprentice of King Tubby before stepping out in his own right, and released a series of classic dub albums under his name on the Greensleeves imprint. Johnny Osborne was another veteran artist who really began to shine in the dancehall era. There's Fally Lover, another release from Junjo Laws, again on the Greensleeves label. Barrington Levy was a younger artist, singer, released a classic series of albums for Junjo, all backed by the Radics. Englishman, Prison Oval Rock, all classics, all very much in the dancehall style. Now, as I've said, what was going on in the dance halls where the sound systems would play began to be reflected more accurately on record. One of the dance hall DJs who came to prominence was called Yellow Man. He was born Winston Foster. He was born an albino, but which put him at kind of at the lower end of the social rung in Jamaican society. Mr. Yellowman, classic LP on the Greensleeves label, rocking the dance hall style there. Pork pie hat tilted at just the right angle. Now he responded with he honed his craft on the live dance sessions before moving to records, again produced by Junjo Laws, backed by the Roots Radics. Classic series, hugely prolific series of albums, and one of his hits was called Mad Over Me, which positioned himself in a humorous way as a sex symbol because of his albinism, and he pulled it off. He was at one time rivaled Bob Marley in popularity.
Hi, my name is Yellowman, and down in Jamaica they call me Mr. Sexy.
Mr. Sexy.
And you see, I come to make you feel happy.
Come to make you feel happy.
Over
It's a dance hall.
Over me, girls are mad over me. And in Jamaica also Miami, hey. Over me, them are mad over me, hey. Over me, them are mad over me.
Playing for convenience from the good old Tougher Than Tough box set.
Hey. Over me, them are mad over me. Me just
Now, Yellow Man, also, as I said, what was happening in the dance halls began to be reflected more accurately on record. One of the first live recordings of a dance session, in fact, maybe the first one, was another Yellow Man record with his then partner Fathead, feeding in the dance hall live at Aces. That's Aces International Sound System. It's on the Jaw Guidance label. This was followed by many different dance session recordings. Basically free-flowing series of artists voicing, improvising their lyrics over pre-recorded rhythm tracks, and just that improvisatory nature was key to the dance hall. There were some other producers that came up that were able to sort of hold their own against Henry Junjo Laws' onslaught in the 1980s. One was a producer called George Fang. He had particular success with Frankie Paul, another young up-and-coming dancehall singer. I've done a longer video on Frankie Paul. Classic one from him, Tidal Wave. Again, on the ubiquitous Greensleeves label, releasing the music internationally. Another prominent and influential DJ, Lone Ranger. It's a set for him from the 1980s called Rosemary, for producer Winston Riley's Techniques label. Another one who sort of was able to hold his own against Henry Laws. Another up-and-coming producer who'd been around since the 1970s, spent a few years in Canada doing electrical work, wiring up studio systems. His name was Lloyd James, who's known on record as Prince Jammy. He was an apprentice of King Tubby, done various productions on his own. Did some early work with Breaking Black Uhuru. he had another production on the Greensleeves label here called, with the artist dancehall singer Half Pint, classic one there. Again, Greensleeves label, you can't go wrong with anything that appeared on that label in the early to mid 80s. Prince Jammy would become more prominent. He was still technically working for King Tubby, began to move more into his own as a producer in his own right. The two finally split in the early 80s, and Prince Jammy was on the ascendance. Again, he has his own sound system as well. By the mid-1980s, Henry Laws was jailed on a drug charge. Henry Laws was involved in the political struggles of between the Jamaican political parties. He was finally gunned down in a drive-by shooting in London in 1999. But he was jailed in the mid-80s, which took him out of the scene. The scene was ripe for a takeover, and Prince Jammy was ideally poised to exploit that. He had lined up a clash with a rival sound called Black Scorpio. And I've got a book called King Jammies by Beth Lesser here. As you can see, Lloyd James there was due for a promotion from Prince Jammy. What happened was, the night of February 23rd, 1985, he had a sound clash where two sound systems would meet and kind of have a battle to see which could win the crowd over with their musical selections, which could flop the other sound in the parlance of the time. He was clashing with Black Scorpio sound, and he had unleashed a musical arsenal that the island had never seen before. He had begun stockpiling copies of a rhythm track built by a young artist called Wayne Smith, and it was built around a Casio keyboard riff, which had never been heard before on the island. Recorded a song called Slang Tang, and Prince Jammy had been busy before the dance building up different versions of this rhythm track with different artists voicing over it. But the first one to hit with it out of the gate was called Slang Tang. The dance, when it was going on, had been going in favor of Black Scorpio. It was actually interrupted for an hour by police armed with M16s who searched the patrons of the dance before it was being allowed to continue. But when Jammy started his set with this Casio keyboard riff built song by Wayne Smith called Slang Tang, the dance was done. This is Slang Tang. Slang Tang rhythm caused an absolute sensation. The dance went wild. Soon what was called digital reggae, or Digi for short, took over the island, and the scene was changed forever. This was Lloyd James. King Jammy was promoted to king as a result of that rhythm track. Soon that was the prevailing sound for the second half of the 1980s as all the other producers fell into line. Wayne Smith came out with the album Slang Tang. And of course King Tubby, who had kind of taken a step back from the music business to concentrate on his electronics repair and build a new state-of-the-art studio, he responded with his own digital selections, nicely anthologized on this Pressure Sounds released, Firehouse Revolution, King Tubby's productions in the digital age. King Tubby there. King Tubby was perhaps the only serious rival to King Jammy at this time, but unfortunately he was senselessly murdered in 1989, and by that point the music was beginning to change again. But that is my look at dancehall, a bit of a quick introduction. Hope you enjoyed, guys. I'm going to leave you with a taste of Tempo by Anthony Redrose, digital song produced by King Tubby.
Can't say me never did I want you. Oh Lord, me tell you. Whoa, 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 whoa. No trouble, take your lot of God, big the shot it, I go feed you. Yeah. No trouble, take your lot of God, big the shot it, I go feed you. Whoa. I just love how the champion sound keep playing. At a reggae multicolor style, him a flash till the morning. And with a little of this, a little of that. Listen my voice through the tweeter box. Some sweeter with an echo chamber. Then don't you know, we are the danger. Temper, my God, this a song in a temper.
Cheers, guys.